Welcome to the end of week 3, and I wanted to just give you some updates. I finished grading the first set of ed puzzles and the first couple of discussion boards, so I just wanted to touch base with you on some of the stuff for those. As far as the ed puzzles go, those all seem to be going okay. And the next couple of weeks are posted, so you can work on those as far ahead as you'd like. The discussion boards, want to talk some about the discussion boards. And so as far as the discussion boards go, overall, you guys are doing a great job on the discussion boards. So for those of you who posted on the discussion boards, what I saw, as far as your responses and your responses to each other, they were great. I've got a couple of comments on some general stuff. One is that you want to make sure that you are completing these weekly. So some of you, I saw that you may have missed one of the discussion boards, and that's okay. Remember, one of them is going to be dropped. But make sure that you are going in every week and completing these. This is big part of lecture points. So these are 10 points a piece. And if you need reminders, remember you can sign up for Remind. I know some of you are already signed up for Remind. The information for that is posted in, I believe it's week 2 on iLearn, as well as on the main course page. So you can sign up for Remind. That will send out reminders to you. At the beginning of the week, it'll send out a summary on Sunday, and then it'll send you reminders 12 hours before something like a discussion board is due, and then it'll send out a reminder a day before something major is due. So like, an exam or a current issue, something like that. So make sure you can sign up for that Remind, and it'll send you out those reminders. Make sure you're going back and responding to your classmates' responses. So some of you missed that part, and that is part of your score. So make sure you're going back after your initial post and responding. I know sometimes when you put your initial post in, there might not be anybody or very few posts to actually respond to. And that's why you've got the extra days after the Thursday due date for your initial post. As far as your responses, overall, they were great as far as your initial responses, but make sure every once in a while I came across parts of responses where either you didn't answer the question fully, or like you're missing part of the answer. For example, like on the cycles, maybe you answered the information about the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle, but you left out the phosphorus cycle. So make sure that you've got all of that in there. But also that you make sure that you're answering the question with details. And if you aren't sure, a couple people have emailed me because they weren't quite sure exactly what I was asking for in a post. Feel free to email me, okay? I'm more than happy to answer and clarify those. But make sure that you're giving information and details from book, videos, outside sources. For example, one of them I noticed for environmental racism, some people either seemed to be confused or gave a very vague answer. I gave credit this time around, but you need to be more specific. So it asked for you to provide an example of environmental racism that you have heard about in local or national news. You may not have realized that you've heard of this and it is environmental racism, so you can Google that sort of stuff. You're more than welcome to go out and search, or whatever search engine you use, but you're more than welcome to go out and search. That's part of this class, is going out and finding some of this information. Some of you I know did that and even searched on some of your classmates' answers, which is awesome. So part of this class is exploring that information and having those discussions with each other. After starting this week and going forward, I'm going to try very hard to make sure that I make it in a couple of times into your discussion boards to make comments. Don't feel bad if I don't comment on your posts every week. I will try to comment on as many as I can, but I might just not be able to get into yours on a given week. Okay, so the comments will be, you know, if I see something that's really interesting or something that I'm like, wait, that's not quite, you know, what it should be, or hey, take a look at this video. This is about, you know, recycling or whatever that you're talking about. I'll put that kind of information in there. All right, so just so you know how I'm grading your discussion boards, because when I put the grades in, there's no way for me to give feedback. So if you're not sure why you got a score, email me and I will definitely take a look and let you know. So I deduct points for the following things. Obviously, responses weren't submitted by deadlines, so your initial responses are due on Thursday. You can submit them after that, anywhere up to the Sunday absolute deadline, but you'll be deducted points if your initial response is submitted after that Thursday at 11:59. Not responding to at least 2 of your classmates' posts with a substantial comment. So you can look at the posted directions, but if you just say, oh, that's a great, you know, idea, or I really like your answer, that's not enough to earn you the points. So not responding will get you deducted points, but also not responding with a substantial comment. I didn't see a lot of those. In fact, I don't think I really saw any comments that would have gotten you points deducted when you commented back. You did a really good job about having, you know, discussion type comments in the ones back to your classmates. Not completely responding to the prompt, so either leaving part out or, you know, missing part of the answer or not providing those details. So make sure that you've got that. And then obviously not completing the discussion. So if you get a 0, that means that there wasn't anything posted. So if you have any questions, like I said, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to discuss that. Now, the other thing is, now that we've gotten a little farther in, I didn't want to get this all set up while we had all of the other craziness going on. If you look in this week on iLearn, there is a survey posted. It says discussion board survey. If we have enough people who are interested in doing this option and have a common time in, you know, a time in common, from the survey, then I will open this option, because I know week after week after week, it can get a little tedious completing discussion boards via text. So what this option is discussing is having a weekly discussion via Zoom. So you can meet together with some of your classmates via Zoom and have the discussion that way, rather than having to do it via the discussion board. So please complete that survey. You would have the option to do either or in a given week. I would moderate it, but that's all I would be there for, and to give, you know, any information you might need, but the discussion would be yours. So and if you have questions about that, you can definitely email me, but please complete that survey as soon as possible. So now I just want to briefly go through just the information from the discussion boards that have been completed and graded. So your introduction to environmental science discussion board, the main themes that you guys think that you were most concerned about and or you thought were the most difficult to fix, generally all kind of had the same ideas. And these are the major themes that we're going to be talking about. If you take a look at the syllabus, climate change, we're going to spend a couple weeks on climate change. Deforestation, that's actually tied into climate change, and a couple of you hit that in the discussion. Consumption, that one kind of goes throughout the whole semester. So consumption of goods is definitely a big issue, which also ties into the last two down there, plastics and waste, because obviously if you consume it, it has to go somewhere. So those are tied together. I know a couple of you also talked about nuclear waste, so we're going to talk about that when we get into energy. because it is a concern, but we're going to see, you know, how much of a concern is it compared to, you know, other things like fossil fuels and sustainable energy. I know a couple people mentioned sustainable energy as a solution for some of our issues. So we're going to hit all of these different topics that you guys are concerned about, and we're going to talk about why they may be the things that are difficult to fix. And I know some of you may have been concerned about, well, why do we have to pick one? And the thing is that they're all important and they all have their own difficulties as far as how we might go about fixing them. And a couple people even mentioned that some of these are linked together, and that's exactly it. Almost everything in environmental science, if you start pulling it apart, for example, fossil fuels, if you address fossil fuels, well, then you start to address climate change. And climate change is addressed with things like deforestation. So a lot of this is linked together. Someone mentioned you were talking about plastics in one of your discussions, which was great, versus glass. And I just wanted to put in here that plastic, the reason why we've moved to plastic, well, why companies have moved to plastic versus the glass bottles is, as you mentioned in your discussion, plastic is cheaper generally to make, although we can recycle glass indefinitely, and we cannot do that with plastic. But the big part of it is that plastic is less likely to break in transport. And so that is the main reason why we've moved to plastic bottles. However, there is a push to move to aluminum from plastic because aluminum has the same sort of properties. So we'll see if that starts to happen. And some more things are showing up in glass. So we'll see what happens in the future. The other thing I wanted to mention is I saw mention of the ozone layer. So the ozone layer, the damage from the ozone layer, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the semester, is from CFCs, which is a very specific chemical, which are no longer used. So the damage to the ozone layer currently is no longer happening, at least from that main source. And there's indications that the ozone layer is actually repairing itself, which is the one good indicator that we have as far as the environment goes. So we can make these changes, and that's actually one of the big success stories in environmental science. Environmental racism, I mentioned that you guys had this question. Some of you had a little bit of a struggle with it, but you had some really great examples overall. A couple of these are ones that haven't been brought up in my courses before. So Cancer Alley down in Louisiana, DuPont in West Virginia, the different pipelines going across the different Native American reservations, and one of those has actually caused some major problems for those regions. Natural disaster relief, you know, if you think about it, yeah, natural disaster relief is not equally distributed during things like hurricanes and landslides and so forth. Many of you mentioned the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which definitely is an issue, but they're not the only ones that have this issue here in the United States, and it also affects very similar sorts of neighborhoods. And so we'll talk some more about some of these areas. And the main thing that they all have in common is these are areas that are poorer and generally are either native populations like the Native Americans or tribal populations, or they're populations of color, unfortunately. And so they are being treated unfairly by policy and by the companies. And so we'll talk about what's kind of being done about some of this. And then a couple people mentioned climate change as far as this goes, and that is true as well. There are populations that are suffering from environmental racism because of climate change for the same reasons. And e-waste, nobody had this one, but I wanted to mention it. This is an issue, especially in countries like China, because there are cities in China where the birth defects are incredibly high. And it's because of electronic waste that has been shipped from developed countries like our own. And e-waste would be laptops, old computers like the big monitors, the big old style tube monitors, television, cell phones, all of those sorts of things. And somebody mentioned, I don't remember if it was in this discussion or another discussion, but those contain toxic materials and heavy metals and so forth, and those things have been leaching into their water. And so those are poorer areas. They're taking that e-waste so it can be processed, but they don't have the same sort of facilities like we would have here in the United States. They don't have the same safety regulations. So we'll talk, like I said, more about some of these and some of these issues as we get into the topics that they fall into. So for example, Cancer Alley and DuPont, those fall into our topic for next week with environmental hazards and health. We'll talk about Flint when we get to water. Pipelines, we can talk about some more when we get to things like energy. All right. And then the last one is the Energy and Cycles discussion board, the one from last week. Nothing much for me to mention on the cycles other just than, to be familiar with how these are alike, how they are different from each other. You all had some very good examples of how you personally could decrease these, or how we can in general decrease these, our impacts at least on them. The one that I wanted to hit real quick from here is veganism or vegetarianism, that question. So overall, you guys hit it. The big one is this one. This is actually the big argument for moving towards vegetarianism or veganism. And that is the 10% rule on food chains. Nobody actually said it, I think, exactly that way. But this is the idea, if you look back in this chapter, that as you move up a food chain, you lose a majority of the energy. So only 10% of the energy moves up. So if you've got producers, plants, and then you've got herbivores, the primary consumers, those primary consumers only get 10% of the energy into their tissues from those producers. And so the idea is that if you go up one more level, which would be where we are if we eat a cow, then you're only getting 1% of the energy from those original producers. And so that's why we're talking about, taking that cow out of the equation and eating at the producer level, eating that lower level, because we can feed more people at that level. We're not losing as much of that energy by taking out the middle cow, right? So the other thing that a lot of you talked about, which was a main focus, was the effect on the cycles, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle for various things, which is also true. But the big thing is right here, this effect on the food chains. And some people also mentioned water, which is also another thing. It impacts the water usage. So there's lots and lots of reasons for moving towards vegetarianism or veganism. But I know a couple of you were like, yeah, but I can't give up meat, for whatever reason that might be, whether it's actual, dietary reasons, or you just can't give up that chicken or burger. And so there's actually a campaign now called Meatless Mondays. They're all over the place. And the idea is just to give up meat one day a week, because just by doing that, we can make a pretty big impact. If everybody gave up meat one day a week from what they're doing now, you can look out on the internet. There's all kinds of impacts that just one change could have for the United States. And the other thing is, and we'll talk more about this when we get into agriculture, the consumption of meat, while it's kind of leveling off here in the United States, it's increasing in other parts of the world, especially areas like Asia, where the population is already quite large. And as they become more affluent, more wealthy, they are going to be consuming more meat. And that is going to cause problems as far as all of this stuff that you guys were talking about. All right. So that's what I've got. Oh, I'll just pop back up so I'm not in the dark. If you have any questions, let me know. That's kind of the summary for our first couple of weeks. So I'll see you in lab.